Emma Caldwell never believed in haunted places until she moved into the old apartment on Ashwick Street. For 3 nights in a row, she woke at exactly 2:45 a.m. to the sound of someone crying in the dark, soft at first, then louder, until it filled the walls around her. But no one lived in the apartment above her, and each night the sobs drew closer, as if the unseen mourner was searching for her. Emma thought the crying would eventually stop. She was wrong. It was only the beginning of something much worse. The sound woke me in the middle of the night, slicing through my sleep so sharply that I bolted upright in bed without understanding why. For a moment I sat in the dark, my heart pounding, ears straining to catch something in the silence. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant hum of traffic outside my apartment, the soft rustle of tree branches brushing against the window. Everything sounded normal. I almost laughed at myself, ready to sink back beneath the blanket, when I heard it again, crying. It was faint at first. Just a soft whimper carried through the walls, thin and fragile, like someone trying to hold it in but failing. I froze, sitting upright in my bed, the blanket clenched tight around my chest as I tried to figure out where it was coming from. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building. The sound seemed to seep from above me, right through the ceiling. I reminded myself that I wasn't the only one living here. Old walls carried noises in strange ways. Maybe someone had a guest, or maybe a child had come to stay with a neighbor upstairs. That explanation comforted me for only a few seconds before the unease settled back in. I'd lived here for 6 months, and I was certain the apartment above mine was empty. Still, the crying continued. I lay perfectly still, listening. It wasn't just crying, it was the sound of someone breaking apart. Tiny gasps for air between sobs, the kind of sound that made your chest ache in sympathy. I tried to dismiss it as some neighbor watching a sad movie, but it didn't have that distant, tinny quality of a television. It was raw. It was human. I turned my head toward the ceiling, and the sound grew sharper, clearer, as though the source had shifted closer. My pulse quickened. I reached for my phone to check the time. The screen glowed, 2:47 a.m. I stared at those numbers, unsettled. Something about the hour made it worse. It wasn't late evening anymore. It wasn't early morning. It was the dead of night, when things felt wrong just by existing. The crying grew louder. My body locked up, a mixture of fear and pity pulling me in opposite directions. Part of me wanted to get out of bed, go upstairs, and see if someone needed help. Another part of me wanted to burrow beneath the blanket, close my eyes, and pretend none of this was happening. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The sound had weight, sinking into my chest, spreading cold through my veins. It wasn't just above me anymore. As I listened, I realized it was centered directly over my bed, as if the person was kneeling there, right above the ceiling, their face pressed against the floorboards, weeping into the space between us. The realization made my skin crawl. Every tiny hair on my arms and neck stood upright. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened, refusing to let a sound escape. I pressed the blanket against my mouth to smother my own breathing, afraid that whatever was on the other side of that ceiling might hear me. I closed my eyes and counted in my head, desperate for the sound to stop. But the crying only grew more desperate, almost frantic, rising and falling with shuddering sobs that filled my ears, making my own eyes water without reason. Then it stopped. The sudden silence crashed over me like a wave, leaving me trembling, gasping, as though I had surfaced from drowning. I kept staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to return, but there was nothing, only silence, heavy and unnatural. My chest heaved every second, stretching into eternity. I wanted to believe it was finally over, but the silence felt wrong, as though the crying had been cut off. Smothered mid-breath, I stayed like that for the rest of the night, wide awake, staring into the shadows, listening to the emptiness pressing in from the walls and ceiling. Each creak of the building made me flinch. Every shift of the shadows across the ceiling made me think something was moving just out of sight. My body ached from the tension of staying so still, but I couldn't move, couldn't sleep, couldn't look away from the spot above my bed where I heard the sobs spill through. And when the first light of dawn finally crept through the curtains, pale and cold, it was the only thing that kept me from breaking apart myself. The silence that followed was almost worse than the crying itself. When the sobs had finally ended, I was left with nothing but the faint ticking of my clock and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep again that night. I just lay there, my body stiff with dread, waiting for the noise to return, but it never did. When the first pale light of morning seeped through the blinds, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it all. The day that followed passed in a blur. My mind felt clouded, heavy, as if the hours of lying awake had left a residue that clung to everything I did. I tried to shake the unease with normal routines: coffee, a shower, scrolling through my phone, answering emails, but each time I glanced at the ceiling, my stomach tightened. The memory of that crying was still too vivid, too human, too impossible to ignore. I told myself that it had to be a neighbor. Someone in the building had been up late, maybe with a visiting child, maybe going through something private. Old walls carried noise strangely, that was all. It had to be. And yet, I couldn't recall ever hearing footsteps, voices, or even the faint sound of furniture moving from the apartment above. It was supposed to be empty, By the time night fell again, the dread had already settled in me like a stone. I turned on every light in the apartment, telling myself brightness would help. I tried reading, watching videos, anything to keep my thoughts from spiraling, but the anticipation chewed at me. I kept glancing at the clock, my eyes darting back every few minutes. Midnight passed, 1 o'clock passed. For a while I began to hope that maybe it had been a one-time thing. At 2:45 a.m. the crying began again. It didn't creep in softly this time. It started loud, raw, and desperate, as if someone had been waiting for the hour to strike. My body reacted instantly. Heart hammering, throat tightening. The sound filled the ceiling above me, vibrating through the plaster, spilling into the corners of the room. It was unmistakable, the sound of grief so deep it shook me where I sat. I pressed my palms hard against my ears, but it didn't help. The cries were inside me somehow, rattling through my bones. I curled forward, gripping the blanket in my fists, rocking slightly as if that could shut it out. But the sobs only grew louder. They weren't random anymore. There was a rhythm to them, a pattern, almost as though whoever was crying was struggling to breathe between fits of grief. The weight of the sound was unbearable. It pressed into my chest, making each breath harder than the last. I stared at the ceiling, my vision blurring with unshed tears I didn't understand. I wasn't crying, but my body reacted as if I were, my throat thick, my eyes stinging. It felt like I was drowning in someone else's sorrow. Then I heard something new, scratching. It was sharp, distinct, nails dragging across the floorboards above me. The sound traveled slowly, deliberately, as though someone or something was crawling across the apartment above, dragging their fingers as they moved. My mouth went dry. My muscles locked so tightly that pain shot down my arms. I couldn't blink. I couldn't breathe. The scratching crept across the ceiling and stopped directly above my bed again. The crying intensified, trembling, broken sobs, louder than before. My entire body shook, and I wanted to scream, but no sound left my throat. I pressed myself flat against the mattress, as though I could melt into it, vanish into the springs, escape from whatever lingered above me. And then, just like the night before, it ended. Not gently, not like someone crying themselves to sleep, but cut off mid-breath as though someone had placed a hand over a mouth or choked the sound from their throat. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I could hear the blood rushing through my veins, but I couldn't hear anything above me anymore. I stared at the ceiling for the rest of the night, afraid to move, afraid to close my eyes, because the silence felt like it was watching me. Sleep was no longer something I could count on. Every night at the same hour, the sobbing returned, dragging me into its grip like a tide. I became a hollow version of myself, moving through the days in a haze. My reflection in the mirror startled me one morning, dark circles under my eyes, skin pale, lips dry. I had barely eaten. My nerves were stretched thin, every sudden noise making me jump. Still, I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. How could I explain that the apartment above mine was supposed to be empty, yet every night I heard someone crying there? Finally, I decided I needed an answer. I went downstairs to the office where the landlord kept his keys and asked about the unit above me. He barely looked up from his newspaper when I mentioned the crying. He waved his hand dismissively and told me the place hadn't been rented in months. I pushed, asking if maybe someone had broken in, but he just shook his head, saying the locks were intact and no one had reported any problems. I walked away feeling more unsettled than before. If no one lived there, then who had been keeping me awake? That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't lie in bed trembling. I would stay awake and listen. I wanted to know if there was a pattern, something I could hold on to, anything to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I sat on my bed with every light in the room turned on, the glow casting away the shadows, but not the dread. My phone was in my hand, the clock glowing faintly at me. I waited, listening to the hum of the building, my pulse pounding in my ears. The minutes crept by. At exactly 2:45 a.m. it began again. The crying erupted suddenly. No slow build this time. It poured through the ceiling as if a dam had broken. The wailing was so heavy, so guttural it made my chest tighten. My hands shook, my eyes burned, but I forced myself not to cover my ears. I needed to hear it, to know if there was more. Then I heard it, the scratching again. It was sharper this time, more insistent, dragging across the floorboards with a sound like knives. Dust trickled down from the ceiling, tiny flecks landing on my blanket. My breath caught in my throat. The sound moved slowly, crawling across the ceiling until it stopped directly above me. The plaster groaned. The wood above creaked as if weight pressed down on it. My gaze locked on a spot just above where I lay, my skin crawling. Then I saw it. A dark spot beginning to form on the ceiling. It spread slowly, widening into an irregular stain that glistened faintly in the light of my lamp. A drop formed and fell onto the blanket. I touched it before I realized what I was doing. The liquid smeared warm and sticky against my fingertips. My stomach churned as the metallic smell hit me. It was blood. The sobbing grew louder, more frantic, as if whoever was above me had realized I had noticed them. I staggered back against the wall, my chest heaving, my hand trembling in the dim light. More drops fell, spattering onto the sheets, staining them dark red. My heart raced so violently that I thought it might stop altogether. The crying turned into something else then. Not words, but sounds that almost formed them, choked attempts at breathing, gasping like someone suffocating. The scratching erupted again, violent this time, as though fingers were clawing at the wood to break through. The ceiling shuddered, dust raining down in thick layers, and I stumbled toward the corner of the room, terrified that something might break through and fall on top of me. Then, in an instant, it all ceased. The crying cut off mid-breath. The scratching ended. The ceiling above me stilled. Only the stains remained, a grotesque reminder smeared across the plaster. I stood frozen for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, unable to blink, unable to move, unable to stop the questions circling in my mind. If the apartment above was truly empty, then what was pressing against the floorboards, bleeding through to me? By the next evening I couldn't bring myself to step foot into the bedroom. The sight of those stains spreading across the ceiling had burned itself into my mind. No amount of scrubbing had erased them completely. Pale shadows of red still lingered above the bed, like faint fingerprints that refused to wash away. The smell was worse, a metallic sweetness that clung to the air, sinking into my clothes, my skin, everything. I tried to air the room out, but it lingered stubbornly, heavy and suffocating. I spent the day pacing the apartment, unable to sit still. My body was exhausted, but my nerves buzzed like live wires. I told myself I would sleep on the couch that night, far away from the bedroom, away from the stains. The thought gave me a thin thread of comfort, as if a change of scenery could protect me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't safe anywhere inside those walls. When night fell, I left the lights on and curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket tightly around myself. I tried to distract my mind with the glow of the television, but nothing reached me. Every second dragged like hours. Every creak of the building made my skin prickle. My eyes never left the clock on the wall. I watched the hands crawl forward, my heartbeat quickening with each minute that passed. At 2:45 a.m. the sound returned, but this time it wasn't above me. The crying seeped from the walls themselves. It started as a low, muffled sob, like someone trapped inside the plaster. Then it grew louder, spreading until it surrounded me. I pressed my palms against the cushions of the couch, my legs trembling under the blanket. The sobs vibrated through the walls, filling the living room, bleeding into the floor beneath me. The air thickened. My chest ached with every breath, as though I had inhaled sorrow itself. The crying was different now, not just sadness, it was rage, despair, and suffering woven into a single sound that made my stomach twist. The walls seemed to quiver, the plaster trembling, as if something behind them was pressing outward. My eyes darted across the room, and for a moment I swore I saw movement. Shadows writhed just beneath the surface of the wall, dark shapes that shifted like bodies pressed against a thin sheet. My throat tightened. The sobbing rose into wails, violent and raw, echoing from every direction. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't only in my ears anymore, it was inside me. My eyes stung with tears, my lungs burned as if I were crying too, though I wasn't. The sobbing forced its way into me, filling me with grief so overwhelming that it felt like drowning. The walls rippled, the ceiling above groaned. For a moment I thought they would collapse inward, spilling whatever was trapped inside into the room with me. My heart thundered, every muscle in my body urging me to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move, rooted to the couch, as if the weight of that sound had pinned me in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The sobbing stopped. The walls stilled. The silence returned. It was absolute, suffocating, so heavy that I felt it pressing against my skin. I took shallow breaths, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile balance kept the quiet intact. That was when I heard it, a soft whimper. It wasn't coming from the ceiling. It wasn't seeping from the walls. It was right behind me. The blanket slipped from my trembling fingers as my body went rigid. Every hair on my neck rose. I could feel something there, just inches away, breathing faintly against my skin. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. My eyes burned with the effort of staring straight ahead, but I knew if I moved, if I acknowledged it, I wouldn't survive the night. The sound grew sharper, closer. A hitching sob, wet and broken, spilled into the silence, brushing against my ear. And I realized then that whatever was in this apartment wasn't just above me or within the walls. It was here with me, and it wanted me to know it. I didn't sleep at all after that night on the couch. The memory of the whimper in my ear stayed with me like a stain I couldn't wash away. Every corner of the apartment felt poisoned. I walked from room to room the next morning, but the air clung thick and sour no matter where I stood. Even in daylight, I felt watched. My own home had turned into something unrecognizable, a trap I couldn't escape from fast enough. By then, I had already made up my mind I was leaving. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing money. None of that mattered compared to the feeling of something breathing against my neck while I sat frozen in the dark. I told myself I would pack a bag and stay in my car until I figured out where to go next. But the sun dipped too quickly, shadows spilling back into the rooms, and I knew I wouldn't have the strength to last another night here. When the clock neared 2:30 a.m., I stood at the door with my bag clutched to my chest. The the keys trembling in my hand. My plan was simple: walk out, get into the car, and drive as far as the tank of gas would carry me. But as I reached for the lock, the sound began. The crying came earlier than usual. It started faint, seeping through the floor this time, rising up from the building itself. My body locked in place, panic taking hold as the sobs spread from beneath my feet into the walls, then into the air itself. I pressed my forehead against the door, desperate to open it, but my hand refused to turn the key. The crying grew louder, rising into shrieks that shook the glass in the windows. I dropped the bag, the keys slipped from my fingers. My body turned on its own, pulled by some invisible force, and I faced the apartment once more. The air pressed heavy against my chest. The light bulbs flickered, shadows crawling along the walls in time with the wails. My mouth went dry, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to collapse. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than before, so total that I could hear the faint rush of blood in my ears. My heart pounded like a drum, every thud echoing in the empty stillness. I held my breath, afraid to break it. Then, from somewhere close to close, I heard a small, shuddering inhale. I wasn't alone. The air around me shifted. Cold fingers brushed across the back of my neck, light but undeniable. My skin erupted in goosebumps as the presence pressed closer. I stumbled backward, my shoulder slamming into the wall, but the sensation followed. I could feel it now, weightless, yet heavy, invisible but so real it made me nauseous. The sobbing returned, but it wasn't in the walls anymore. It was inside the room with me. A broken sound filled with pain and suffocation, loud enough that it rattled my chest. I covered my ears, but the noise grew sharper, closer, as if it were spilling directly into my head. And then, without warning, it changed. The sobbing twisted into something worse, breathing fast, shallow gasps, as though someone were crouched just behind me, their mouth opening against my ear. The air grew damp and warm. My vision shook. I couldn't breathe. I pressed against the wall, desperate to sink through it, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere left to go. I forced my eyes to the ceiling, and my heart nearly stopped. The stain above my bed had spread across the plaster, stretching wide and jagged, and for the first time I saw movement within it. The surface bulged outward as if something inside was trying to break free. A dark handprint pressed through from the other side, smearing the ceiling with black-red streaks. Another followed, then another. The crying turned into a chorus, not one voice but many layered sobs, screams, gasps all around me, shaking the walls, the ceiling, the floor. My body convulsed with terror, my knees giving out as I collapsed to the ground. The sound swallowed me whole. I crawled toward the door, my fingers scraping across the wood, but when I reached for the handle it wouldn't turn. The metal was ice cold, searing my skin. I slammed my fist against it, begged under my breath for it to open, but the cries drowned out even my own voice, and then they stopped again. The silence hit so suddenly it left my ears ringing. I crouched there in the stillness, my hand on the doorknob trembling so violently I could barely stay upright. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart clawing at my chest. I dared to look back one last time. The ceiling was smooth. The stains were gone. The walls were bare. The room looked exactly as it had the first day I moved in, empty, ordinary, harmless, as though none of it had ever happened. But the silence was worse than anything, because in it, I realized something that froze my blood more than the crying ever had. The sound hadn't stopped, it had just moved, and this time it wasn't coming from above me, or from the walls, or even the floor. It was inside me.